Marcus Webb slammed his fist on the table, looked straight at Jordan Clay, and said, "Not the help," like she was furniture. The man had just eaten every dish she cooked, demanded to meet the genius behind it, and dismissed that exact person standing 2 feet away from him. Jordan didn't flinch. She set the bread basket down slowly, the way someone does when they're not surprised, when they've already decided what happens next. What Webb didn't know was that the woman he just looked through had spent 3 years documenting every recipe, every date, every email. Not out of paranoia, out of patience. He didn't make a scene. He made a mistake. And somewhere in the pocket of her server's apron, a phone held a contact she'd saved 3 years ago and never had to use. Until tonight. You've seen people get dismissed their whole lives and do nothing. But what happens when the person being dismissed has been quietly building a case the entire time, and the moment you humiliate them in public is the exact moment they decide they're done waiting? Jordan Clay woke up at 4:47 every morning, not because she had to, because the prep work started at 6, and she needed the hour before that to think, quietly, alone, before the kitchen filled with noise and other people's opinions. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from 11 South, in a building where the elevator had been broken for 8 months and nobody was fixing it. 3rd floor. She walked it every day without complaint, the same way she walked most things in her life, steadily without expecting anyone to notice. Her monthly take-home was $3,200. After rent, utilities, and the student loan she was still chipping away at from culinary school, she had roughly $400 left, some months less. She kept a handwritten budget on a notepad stuck to her refrigerator. Every line item in blue ink, no guessing. The title on her employment contract read Kitchen Creative Consultant. It was a title Derek Holt had created specifically for her, one that didn't appear on any menu, any press release, or any award nomination. When Food and Wine called 11 South the most exciting kitchen in America, Jordan's name was not in the article. When the James Beard Committee reached out for nominations, Derek handled the correspondence. Jordan handled the food. Every morning she arrived before anyone else. She restocked her spice jars in a specific order, not because someone told her to, but because consistency was how she protected quality when everything else was unpredictable. She labeled her prep containers with date and time, down to the hour. She kept a spiral notebook in her locker where she wrote down every dish she developed, ingredients, ratios, technique, the memory or feeling that inspired it. Her coworkers liked her. Some of them quietly knew. None of them said anything out loud because Derek signed their schedules. Most evenings, Jordan took the stairs back up to her apartment, heated something simple, and sat at her small kitchen table, reviewing whatever she'd written that day. Not obsessing. Just maintaining a record the way a careful person maintains a record, because you never know when the truth is going to need proof. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. She was just very, very precise about what she kept. There was a rule Jordan had carried since she was 19. Her grandmother had told her, not as advice, more as a statement of fact, the way you tell someone the stove is hot. The only thing nobody can take from you is what you actually know how to do. So know how to do it better than anyone in the room. Jordan had taken that seriously in a way most people don't take things seriously. She didn't cut corners on technique because she was tired. She didn't approximate measurements because the night was running long. When she developed a new dish, she made it 17, sometimes 20 times before she considered it finished, adjusting one variable at a time, writing down what changed, what didn't, and why. Not because anyone was grading her. Because she had decided that the standard she held herself to was not connected to whether anyone was watching. That discipline showed up in small ways that most people missed. The way she listened during service, not just to orders, but to the rhythm of the kitchen, the timing between stations, the subtle signs that something was about to fall behind before it actually did. She could feel a dinner rush going sideways 4 minutes before it happened. She'd learned to trust that instinct not because it was mystical, but because she'd paid close enough attention for long enough that her brain was processing information her conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. She didn't talk about this. It wasn't humility exactly. It was more that she understood, clearly, practically, that explaining your capabilities to people who haven't asked is just noise. You show it in the work, then you let the work speak at whatever volume it needs to. What she didn't show, not to Derek, not to her coworkers, not to anyone, was the quiet calculation that lived underneath her patience. Late at night, after the notebook was closed and the apartment was still, She sometimes sat with a thought she never said out loud. People who hold power over others almost always assume the person beneath them isn't keeping score. That assumption is where they make their first mistake. She didn't dwell on it. She filed it the same way she filed everything, precisely, without sentiment. Jordan also understood something about systems that most people learn too late. Institutions protect themselves first. If she ever needed to prove something, no one was going to hand her the stage. She would have to build it herself, piece by piece, from evidence that couldn't be argued with. So she kept the notebook. She kept the timestamps. She kept every email she ever sent Derek with a new recipe attached, every photo of her handwritten notes, every text where he'd said, "Use this for Thursday's tasting," about something she'd created alone. Not because she planned to use them. Because she understood that preparation is the only form of protection available to someone without leverage. The Webb Capital Anniversary Dinner had been on the books for 11 weeks. It was the biggest private event 11 South had ever hosted. 112 guests, $340 per head, a custom tasting menu that Derek had pitched personally to Webb's event coordinator. The contract was worth more than the restaurant's average monthly revenue. Derek had spent 3 weeks doing press around it, giving quotes to 2 food blogs and a local magazine about his vision for Southern fine dining reimagined. Jordan had spent those same 3 weeks developing every dish on the menu. What nobody outside the kitchen knew was that Derek's contract with 11 South was up for renewal in 31 days. The anniversary dinner was, functionally, his audition. A strong showing meant a new 3-year deal, a salary increase, and, according to what Jordan had overheard in a phone call she wasn't meant to hear, a potential partnership stake in the restaurant group's second location opening in Savannah. Derek needed this dinner to go perfectly. Jordan needed something different. She had received a letter 14 days ago from her culinary school professor, Dr. Renata Miles, the woman who had told her, quietly and consistently for 3 years, to document everything. The letter wasn't alarming, it was practical. Dr. Miles was stepping back from her consulting work at the end of the quarter. If Jordan ever intended to move on the documentation she'd been keeping, the window of having someone with institutional credibility willing to review and authenticate it was closing. "I'm not going anywhere permanently," Dr. Miles had written, "but my ability to be formally useful to you shrinks significantly after October. Whatever you've been waiting for, I'd think carefully about how much longer you wait." Jordan had read that letter 4 times. She wasn't impulsive. She didn't make decisions under pressure. But she also understood deadlines in a way that people who have never had to protect themselves rarely do, as hard edges, not suggestions. 31 days until Derek's contract renewed. 14 days until Dr. Miles's window narrowed. 1 dinner standing between Jordan and the clearest moment of leverage she would ever have. She didn't know yet that Derek would call in sick 40 minutes before service. She didn't know she'd be running the kitchen alone. She didn't know Marcus Webb would slam his fist on a table and demand to meet a genius. She just knew the clock was running, and she had never, not once in 3 years, been late. 3 weeks before the Webb dinner, Jordan noticed something small. Derek had started carrying a leather portfolio to meetings with the restaurant's ownership group. He'd never done that before. Derek was a talker. He worked rooms with charm and eye contact and the particular confidence of someone who had learned early that presence could substitute for preparation. He didn't take notes. He didn't bring folders. He showed up and performed. The portfolio was new. Jordan wouldn't have thought about it twice, except that 2 days later, she found a printed copy of her red clay spice rub recipe on the corner of Derek's desk. Her handwriting, her ratios, her notes in the margins, with a sticky note attached in Derek's handwriting that said, "Beard submission, technique section." She stood there for exactly 4 seconds. Then she took a photo of it with her phone, put everything back exactly as she'd found it, and walked back to her station. She didn't confront him. She didn't mention it. She filed the photo in a folder on her phone labeled Kitchen Admin, the same folder where she'd been quietly storing similar images for the better part of 2 years. Receipts for specialty ingredients she'd purchased personally and expensed. Screenshots of text messages where Derek had forwarded her written recipes to the restaurant's PR contact with 0 attribution. A photo of the food and wine cover story next to a photo of the original handwritten recipe in her notebook, dated 14 months earlier. The folder had 47 items in it. What struck Jordan, not emotionally but analytically, was the pattern she could now see clearly. Derek wasn't just taking credit casually, the way insecure managers sometimes did. He was doing it systematically. The portfolio, the award submission, the press quotes that always included phrases like, "my interpretation of Southern cooking," and "a flavor language I've developed over 20 years." It was a constructed narrative. And constructed narratives have architecture, which meant they also had weak points. She began paying attention differently after that. She noticed that Derek never described the technical process behind any dish in interviews, only the emotional story around it. He talked about his grandmother's kitchen in Tennessee, about road trips through the Delta, about the philosophy of place-based cooking. Beautiful language, completely disconnected from the actual technique involved in executing the food. Jordan, by contrast, could describe exactly why the smoked shrimp needed 48 hours at 155 degrees before the final sear. She could explain the chemical reaction that made the red clay spice rub behave differently on beef than on pork. She could reproduce any dish on that menu from memory, adjust it for altitude, humidity, or a different protein, and tell you precisely why each substitution would or wouldn't work. Derek could tell you a story about it. Jordan could prove it. She filed that distinction carefully, not as anger, as information. The situation with Marcus Webb wasn't the first time Jordan had watched someone get erased in that dining room. 6 months earlier, a line cook named Theo had been quietly pushed out after Derek presented Theo's fermented pepper sauce, something Theo had been developing in his own time, bringing in on his days off to test. As a new addition to the tasting menu, Derek had framed it as a collaborative kitchen effort. Theo's name was never mentioned. When Theo raised it privately with Derek, he was put on a reduced schedule the following week. 2 weeks after that, he wasn't on the schedule at all. Jordan had watched the whole sequence happen. She had said nothing. That silence had cost her something she hadn't fully accounted for at the time. A small piece of her own credibility with herself. A quiet understanding that staying invisible had a price she was paying in installments. Now, standing at table 7 with an empty breadbasket in her hands, she was watching it happen again. Except this time the person being erased was her. The question she turned over in those few seconds wasn't whether to act, it was how. She had 2 options, and she understood both of them clearly. Option 1. She could step forward right now, in front of 112 guests, and say, "I'm the chef." It would be true. It would also be immediately deniable. Derek wasn't present. There was no corroboration in the room, and Marcus Webb, a man who had already decided what he was looking at when he looked at her, was not predisposed to believe her. She would look like a server making a desperate claim. The story would end there, unfavorably. Option 2, she could say nothing tonight, walk to the back alley after service, and make the call she had been putting off for 3 years. The ethical weight of option 2 was real, and she didn't pretend otherwise. Staying silent in that room meant watching Webb leave without knowing the truth. It meant one more night of Derek Holt getting credit he hadn't earned. It meant the story didn't break tonight. But Jordan had learned something from watching Theo, from watching what happened when someone reacted from the wound instead of from the strategy. Reacting in the room would feel like justice for approximately 45 seconds. Then the room would move on, Webb would dismiss it, Derek's people would spin it, and she'd have spent the only real leverage she had on a moment of visibility that changed nothing structurally. What would you do if you had the evidence, the timing, and exactly one shot to make it can't count? She set the breadbasket down, walked calmly toward the kitchen, and started thinking about what needed to happen next. The back alley behind 11 South smelled like damp concrete and the ghost of 1,000 dinner services. Jordan stood there for 6 minutes after the last table cleared. She knew it was 6 minutes because she counted, not anxiously, but the way she counted everything. Precisely because precision was how she kept herself from making decisions she couldn't reverse. She ran the risks in her head the same way she ran a new recipe, methodically, one variable at a time. If she called Dr. Miles tonight and set things in motion, there was no version of tomorrow where she still had this job. Derek would find out. The restaurant's ownership group would close ranks. They always did, because Derek was the face on the website, the name in the press releases, the asset they had built their marketing around. Jordan was a line item in the back of house budget, with a title nobody could explain at a dinner party. She would be dismissed, probably quietly, possibly with language designed to make her look unstable or difficult. She had $400 in discretionary income this month. She had no backup employment lined up. She had a loan payment due in 19 days. Those were not small things. She also thought about Theo, where he was now, what it had cost him to say something too early, without enough foundation, how the system had processed his complaint and spat him out in under 2 weeks, without leaving a mark on anyone who mattered. Jordan was not Theo. Her documentation was deeper, more organized, more legally legible than anything Theo had. But the machinery that would move against her if she miscalculated was the same machinery. It didn't care about the quality of her evidence. It cared about protecting its own continuity. If she moved too fast, she lost. If she waited too long, Dr. Miles's window closed and Derek's contract renewed, and the architecture of the next 3 years locked into place around her silence. She looked down at her phone. Dr. Miles's number was already on the screen. She hadn't dialed it yet. She was just looking at it the way you look at a door you've been standing in front of for a long time, knowing that once you open it, the hallway you were standing in no longer exists. She thought about what her grandmother used to say. Timing isn't luck. Timing is just patience that finally ran out. Her thumb hovered. She dialed, Doctor. Miles picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call, or something close to it. Jordan had learned to notice things like that. I think tonight is the night, Jordan said. No preamble. No explanation of what had happened in the dining room. Just that one sentence, because Dr. Miles already knew the context. She'd known it for 3 years. There was a brief pause on the other end. Tell me what you have, Dr. Miles said. Jordan went through it methodically, standing in the alley with one hand pressed flat against the brick wall. The spiral notebooks, 14 of them, dating back to her first month at 11 South. Each recipe logged with date, time, and the development notes she'd written in real time. The photographs of her handwritten recipes on Derek's desk, with his annotations added later. The email chain where Derek had forwarded her notes to the restaurant's PR firm, word for word, under his own name. The text messages, the food and wine cover, the James Beard submission she'd found referenced in Derek's sent folder, the one that used her technique descriptions verbatim in a document she had never been shown. Doctor, Miles was quiet for a moment after Jordan finished. How organized is it? Chronological folders, digital and physical, every item dated. The emails are screenshotted with headers visible, sender, recipient, timestamp. The notebooks are numbered on the spines. Another pause, shorter this time. Jordan, that's not just documentation. That's a case file. I know. There's a food journalist, Marcus Reeves. He's based in Atlanta, covers the industry seriously, not a gossip column. He's broken 2 kitchen credit stories in the last 4 years, both of them held up because his sourcing was airtight. Doctor, Miles spoke carefully, the way she did when she was thinking through consequences in real time. If your documentation is what you're describing, he's the right person. But once you send it, you don't control the timeline anymore. I understand that. You'll lose the job. I know. They may try to come after your professional reputation before the story runs. Create a counter-narrative. I've thought about that. What Jordan didn't say out loud, what she kept folded quietly in the part of herself she rarely showed anyone, was that she had already grieved this job a long time ago. She had let go of it in small pieces over 3 years, every time she watched her work walk out of the kitchen under someone else's name. There was nothing left to lose that she hadn't already been losing slowly. She took one breath. Send me his contact information, she said. I'll put the package together tonight. She went back inside to finish the closing checklist. Steady, unhurried, like someone who had already decided. She sent the package to Marcus Reeves at 2:14 in the morning. It was 43 pages. A cover letter explaining the timeline clearly and without emotion. The documentation organized into 4 sections: original recipes, evidence of forwarding, published attributions, and a comparative analysis. She'd written herself showing 18 specific instances where language from her private notebooks appeared verbatim in Derek's public-facing interviews and award submissions. She didn't ask Reeves to believe her. She asked him to look at the dates. Then she went to sleep. She was back in the kitchen at 6 a.m. Derek called at 6:47. Cheerful, no mention of the night before, asking how service had gone. Jordan told him it went well. He said good, said he was feeling better, said he'd be in for the lunch prep. She said okay. She hung up and went back to portioning the breakfast mise en place. That was a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Reeves had responded. He'd reviewed the first section of the documentation and wanted to meet. His email was 3 sentences long and entirely professional. The last line read, "If the remaining sections are consistent with what I've already seen, this is a significant story." Jordan read it once, replied with her availability, and told nobody. Saturday, Derek posted an Instagram photo of himself plating a dish, Jordan's cast-iron cornbread souffle, with the caption, "Pushing the boundaries of Southern technique, one service at a time." It got 4,200 likes. Jordan saw it on her lunch break, sitting in her car in the parking structure 2 blocks from the restaurant. She looked at it for a long moment. The photo was beautiful. The dish was beautiful. She knew every decision that had gone into it. The cast iron temperature, the resting time, the exact ratio of stone-ground cornmeal that made the interior set the way it did. She put her phone face down on the passenger seat. What she felt in that moment wasn't rage. It was something quieter and more specific. The particular exhaustion of watching a lie perform well in public. Knowing the truth was sitting in a folder on a journalist's desk, 40 miles away, and there was nothing to do but wait. She finished her lunch, went back inside, ran a perfect Saturday service, and said nothing to anyone. The call came on a Tuesday, not from Reeves. From the restaurant's general manager, a man named Paul Strick, who had been with 11 South since it opened and whose primary loyalty had always been, without ambiguity, to whoever kept the reservation book full. "We need you to come in early," he said, "before the other staff arrive." Jordan arrived at 8. Derek was already there, sitting at the bar with his arms crossed and an expression she had never seen on him before. Not angry, exactly, but tightly controlled in a way that told her he already knew something had shifted. Paul spoke first. "It's come to our attention that you've been sharing internal kitchen documentation with outside parties." He kept his voice neutral, the way people do when they've rehearsed what they're saying. "Proprietary recipes, technique development notes, materials that were created within this restaurant and belong to this restaurant." Jordan said nothing. "We consider that a serious breach of your employment agreement," Paul continued. "Specifically Section 4, Paragraph 2, confidentiality of creative and operational materials developed during the course of employment." Derek leaned forward slightly. "I've given you every opportunity, Jordan. I brought you in when nobody else would look at you. I built this platform. And you've been going behind my back to," he paused, recalibrated, "to misrepresent how this kitchen operates to someone in the press." There it was. Not a conversation, a framing. Delivered early, before witnesses arrived, before the story ran, designed to establish a counter-narrative that would already be in circulation by the time anything went public. She was the disgruntled employee, the one who couldn't handle her role, the one who had taken proprietary materials and weaponized them out of personal grievance. It was, she had to admit, a competent move. Paul slid a single sheet of paper across the bar toward her. "We're prepared to offer a mutual separation agreement, 2-week severance, a neutral employment reference, in exchange for a signed NDA covering all kitchen operations, recipes, and any ongoing communications with press contacts." Jordan looked at the paper. She thought about the 43 pages sitting on Marcus Reeves's desk. She thought about 14 numbered notebooks stored in a fireproof box under her bed. She thought about Section 4, Paragraph 2 of her employment agreement, which she had read, carefully, the week she signed it. Then she looked up at Paul Strick. "I'd like to take this home and review it," she said calmly. "I'll have a response by end of business tomorrow." She read Section 4, Paragraph 2 that night, twice. Then she read the entire employment agreement. All 11 pages of it, including the sections she had skimmed 3 years ago because she had been 26 and grateful and not yet fluent in the language of documents designed to protect institutions rather than people. The confidentiality clause was broad, deliberately so. It covered any creative, operational, or developmental materials produced during the course of employment and assigned ownership of those materials to 11 South Restaurant Group, LLC. On its face, it looked like exactly what Paul Strick had said it was. But Jordan had taken a contract law class as an elective in culinary school, not because she thought she'd need it, but because her professor had told the class on the first day, "The food industry will try to own everything you create. Understand what that means before you sign anything." She had kept her notes from that class in the same organized way she kept everything. The clause covered materials produced during the course of employment. Jordan's first notebook predated her employment at 11 South by 4 months. She had started developing the red clay spice rub in her apartment in a notebook she had purchased herself, while she was still working a prep cook job across town. The notebook had a receipt from a grocery store tucked inside the front cover. She had taped it there the day she bought the book, for no reason she could have articulated at the time, except that it felt right to mark the beginning of something. That receipt was dated March 3rd. Her 11 South employment agreement was signed July 19th, 4 months and 16 days. She also understood something else about the clause that Paul Strick had either not noticed or hoped she wouldn't notice. It covered materials produced during employment. It said nothing about materials that predated employment and were subsequently used during employment without the employee's documented consent. There was a legal distinction there. It was not a large distinction. It was not the kind of distinction that won cases in isolation, but it was a real one, and in combination with the documentation she had, the timestamps, the emails, the evidence of Derek forwarding her work under his name, it created a very different picture than the one Paul Strick had laid out across the bar. The NDA they wanted her to sign would close that picture permanently. By 11 p.m., she had forwarded the separation agreement to Dr. Miles with a 2-paragraph summary of her analysis. Doctor. Miles responded in 40 minutes with the name of an employment attorney she knew in Atlanta, a woman who had handled 2 IP cases in the restaurant industry specifically. Don't sign anything, doctor, Miles wrote. Not yet. Jordan set her phone down. Outside her window, the city was doing what cities do at midnight, running quietly on its own logic, indifferent to any individual thread inside it. She thought about how systems work, how they move fast when they feel threatened, how the speed of the move against her was, itself, a form of information. They were scared. That told her the documentation was exactly as strong as she thought it was. There were 4 people at 11 South who knew the truth, not suspected it, knew it. With the specific, uncomfortable certainty of people who had watched it happen up close and said nothing, for reasons that made sense individually and added up to something harder to live with collectively. Marcus, the sous chef, had been there the night Jordan developed the smoked short rib. He had watched her work through 7 versions of it over 3 weeks, had tasted each iteration, had written down her adjustments at her request when her hands were full. He knew whose dish it was the same way he knew his own name. He also had a daughter in her 2nd year of college and a mortgage on a house he'd bought 8 months ago. Derek signed his performance reviews. Camille, the pastry assistant, had accidentally been copied on an email chain 6 months earlier. A thread between Derek and the food and wine editor that included Jordan's original corn souffle recipe, forwarded by Derek with the words, "Here's the technique breakdown I mentioned." Camille had read it, understood what she was looking at, closed the email, and never mentioned it to anyone. She was on a work visa. Her immigration status was tied to her employment. She had told herself it wasn't her situation to fix. The 2 other servers who had been in the dining room the night of the web dinner, both of them had watched Jordan run that kitchen alone for 4 hours, had seen her plate every course, had heard the compliments coming back from the tables. They knew she was the one who had made what Marcus Webb slammed his fist over. Neither of them had said anything when Paul Strick pulled Jordan in early Tuesday morning. They had arrived at 9, seen her car already in the lot, exchanged a look, and gone about their opening work in silence. Jordan knew about all 4 of them, not because they had told her, but because she paid attention. She understood their situations without resentment. The mortgage, the visa, the schedules, the quiet calculations people make when speaking up costs more than they can afford to spend. She wasn't counting on any of them. That had never been the plan. The plan had always been to build something that didn't require anyone else's courage to hold together. Documentation so clear, so independently verifiable, that the truth could stand on its own without a single witness needing to raise their hand. But sitting alone in her apartment that night, she felt the weight of it anyway. Not bitterness, just the specific loneliness of being right in a room full of people who already know it. The attorney's name was Claire Okafor. She called Jordan the following morning at 9, having already reviewed the summary Dr. Miles had forwarded. Her first question wasn't about the documentation. It was about the separation agreement deadline. They gave you until end of business today? Yes, that's not standard. Standard is 5 to 7 business days minimum for review of a separation agreement. The fact that they gave you 24 hours tells me they want this closed before something happens that makes closing it harder. She paused. Has the journalist contacted them yet? Not that I know of. They may have found out about him independently. Does anyone at the restaurant know you've been in contact with press? Jordan thought about it. She had made the call from the back alley. She had sent the package from her personal laptop on her home network. She had told no one inside the building. "No," she said. "Not from me." Then they're moving on instinct, which means they're scared of what you might do, not what you've already done. Claire's voice was even, analytical. "That's useful. Don't sign anything today. I'm going to send them a response by 4 o'clock, requesting a standard review period and legal representation. That's our right under Georgia employment law. They cannot legally pressure you to sign before you've had adequate time in counsel." Jordan wrote down the key points on the notepad by her kitchen table. "What's our position on the confidentiality clause?" she asked. "Complicated but not unfavorable. Pre-employment materials are defensible. The forwarding of those materials by a third party without your consent is a separate issue that the NDA cannot retroactively cover. The question is whether we can establish that the materials in question originated before your employment date." Claire stopped. "Can we?" The first notebook has a grocery receipt taped inside the front cover, dated March 3rd. "My employment agreement is dated July 19th of the same year." A silence on the line. "You taped a receipt inside the cover of a notebook 4 months before you were hired." "I mark the beginning of things," Jordan said simply. Another pause, longer this time. "Jordan, I need you to understand something. The documentation you've described, if it's as organized and time-stamped as Dr. Miles indicated, is not a normal situation. Most people in your position have feelings and memories. You have a case file." Claire's voice shifted slightly, something between professional admiration and concern. "That's your strongest asset. It's also going to make them come at you harder once they realize what they're dealing with." "I know. The next 72 hours are critical. Don't go into the restaurant. Don't contact Derek or Paul Strick directly. Don't post anything on social media. Just hold." Jordan looked at the notepad. 14 days until Dr. Miles's window. 9 days until her loan payment. 0 days until the separation agreement deadline she was now refusing to meet. She was out of a job, out of income, and about to send a legal response that would remove any remaining doubt about which direction this was going. She held the pen over the notepad. "Okay," she said. "I'll hold." Marcus Reeves called her Thursday afternoon. He had spent 4 days with the documentation, all 43 pages. He had cross-referenced the dated notebooks against every published interview Derek had given in the past 3 years. Magazine features, podcast appearances, a 20-minute segment on a regional food television program where Derek had described, in specific technical detail, the development of the red clay spice rub as a personal culinary journey rooted in his Tennessee childhood. Reeves had found something Jordan hadn't included in the package. "There's a 2019 interview," he said, in a small Atlanta food quarterly. Derek is asked directly, word for word, "How did you develop the spice profile for the short rib?" And he gives a 3-paragraph answer about foraging for red clay mineral notes in the Georgia-Piedmont region, about his process of trial and error over 18 months. Jordan waited. "Your first notebook entry for that spice rub is dated 11 months before that interview." The entry includes the words. Reeves read carefully, "Red clay from Grand's yard, trying to find the mineral note in the crust, not the smoke." The room was very quiet. "He didn't just take credit for the dish," Reeves continued. "He constructed an origin story for it. A specific, detailed, emotionally resonant origin story that he has repeated across multiple platforms over 4 years. That's not a misunderstanding about attribution. That's fabrication." Jordan had known this in the way you know something you've lived with for a long time. But hearing it stated plainly, by someone with no stake in the outcome, by someone who had arrived at the same conclusion independently through nothing but the evidence, it landed differently than she expected. Not as vindication, not yet, as weight. "Is it enough?" she asked. Reeves was quiet for a moment. "The notebooks alone are compelling." "The notebooks plus the email chain plus the interview fabrications." He paused. "I've built stories on less, but I want one more thing. I want to show you the finished comparison document before I send it to my editor. I want you to verify every factual claim independently before it goes anywhere." He wasn't asking her to trust him. He was asking her to verify him. Jordan recognized that instinct immediately because it was the same one she operated on. "Send it," she said. "I'll turn it around in 24 hours. Reeves's comparison document arrived Friday morning. It was 31 pages. Clean, methodical, devastating in the way that only facts arranged in the right order can be devastating. Jordan read it twice. Then she found the error. Page 19. a side-by-side comparison between her notebook entry for the cast-iron cornbread souffle, and a quote from Derek's Food and Wine feature. Reeves had dated her notebook entry as October 4th. The actual date, written in her own handwriting in Notebook 7, was October 14th, a 10-day difference. In isolation, it meant nothing. The Food and Wine feature had run 8 months after either date. The timeline of credit theft was intact regardless. But Jordan understood something about how these things worked, how a single factual error, however minor, becomes the crack that an opposing narrative drives a wedge into. Derek's attorney, the restaurant group's PR firm, anyone with an interest in discrediting the story, would find that error within hours of publication and use it to cast doubt on every other data point in the document. If she can't get the date right on page 19, how do we know the rest is accurate? She called Reeves. He picked up on the first ring. Page 19, she said. October 14th, not October 4th. Notebook 7, third entry from the top right margin. A long pause. I transposed it, he said quietly. I was working from a photograph, and the 4 looked like a 0 in the light. I know. Fix it before it goes to your editor. Another pause, heavier this time. Jordan, if I'd run that, fix it, she said again. Not unkindly, just clearly. She hung up and sat very still at her kitchen table. That was the moment it hit her. Not the injustice of the past 3 years. Not the NDA sitting unsigned in her email. Not the loan payment 9 days away. Just the simple, brutal reality of how close everything always was to falling apart. One transposed digit. One small crack. 3 years of meticulous documentation nearly undermined by a photograph taken in bad light. She put her head in her hands, not crying, just letting herself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as she needed to. The exhaustion of being the person who catches every error because she has to, because there is no margin, because the system that was supposed to protect people like her had been busy protecting Derek Holt's cookbook deal instead. She had done everything right. She had documented everything, organized everything, built something airtight from nothing, with no resources, no backing, no one in her corner except a professor who answered emails after midnight and an attorney she'd met 4 days ago. And it had almost come apart over one digit on page 19 of a document she hadn't even written. She sat there for a while. Then she got up, made coffee, and emailed Reeves the corrected date in writing, with a photograph of the notebook entry attached. Because that was what you did. You caught the error. You fixed it. You kept going. Even when keeping going felt like carrying something nobody else could see. Her grandmother called that Saturday morning the way she called every Saturday, at 8 a.m. Exactly, from the same landline she'd had for 30 years, in the same house where Jordan had learned to cook. Jordan almost didn't pick up, not because she didn't want to talk, but because she didn't trust herself to sound like everything was fine. And she had been sounding like everything was fine for 3 years, and she was tired of it. She picked up anyway. "You eat breakfast?" her grandmother asked. "Not yet. That's your problem right there." Jordan laughed despite herself. It was a small sound, but real. The kind that surfaces unexpectedly from somewhere underneath whatever you've been holding. Her grandmother's name was Estelle Clay. She was 79 years old and had cooked professionally for 40 of them, in church kitchens, at catering companies, in the homes of families who paid her well and credited her never. She had fed people at funerals and weddings and Sunday suppers for 4 decades without a single byline, a single award nomination, a single article written about her cooking in her name. She had also never once suggested that Jordan accept less than what she was worth. "Gran," Jordan said, and then stopped. "I know," Estelle said. "You don't know what I was going to say. Baby, I've known something was coming for about a year now. You get a certain kind of quiet when you're carrying something. Same quiet you had the week before you left for culinary school." A brief pause.
"You doing okay?"
Jordan looked around her apartment, the notepad by the table, the fireproof box under her bed, the coffee she'd made and not yet drunk. "I'm scared," she said. It was the first time she had said that out loud to anyone. Of what specifically? That it won't matter. That I'll have done everything right and it still won't be enough. That the story runs and people read it for 2 days and then move on and nothing actually changes. Estelle was quiet for a moment. "You remember what I told you about the first time I asked to have my name on a catering menu? They said no. They said no 3 times over 4 years. Then the woman who ran that company retired and her daughter took over, and the daughter put my name on everything from day one because she'd grown up watching her mother take credit for my food and she'd always known it was wrong." Estelle's voice was steady, unhurried. Change doesn't always come when you demand it. Sometimes it comes because you were right long enough that eventually the wrong thing couldn't hold anymore. Jordan held the phone against her ear and didn't say anything for a moment. "Eat breakfast," her grandmother said. "Then go do what you need to do." The story published on a Tuesday, 6 days after Jordan had sent Reeves the corrected notebook photograph. The headline was simple: "Whose kitchen is it? How one chef's work built a restaurant's reputation under someone else's name." It ran with 4 images. The first was a photograph of Jordan's notebook. Notebook 3, page 11. The original red clay spice rub formula in her handwriting, dated and timed. The second was a screenshot of Derek's 2019 interview, the 3-paragraph origin story about foraging in the Georgia Piedmont. The third was the email chain, Derek forwarding Jordan's handwritten recipe notes to the Food and Wine editor, time-stamped, with headers showing sender, recipient, and the complete unedited body of the message. The fourth was the Food and Wine cover, Derek's face, Jordan's dish. The piece ran 4,200 words. Reeves had done what he said he would do. Every factual claim independently verified, every comparison drawn from primary sources, every date confirmed against documentary evidence that existed before the story was ever conceived. He had also done something Jordan hadn't anticipated. He had contacted Derek's previous restaurant, a smaller operation in Nashville, where Derek had worked for 2 years before 11 South, and spoken to 2 former colleagues there. Both had described a similar pattern, a junior cook whose specialty dishes had migrated onto the tasting menu under Derek's name. Neither had documented it, neither had taken any formal action, but both had agreed to go on record with their names attached. The pattern wasn't an anomaly, it was a practice. By noon on Tuesday, the story had been shared 11,000 times. By 3 o'clock, Derek had posted a statement on his Instagram, 3 paragraphs describing Jordan as a valued collaborator whose contributions he had always acknowledged internally, and framing the story as a misleading characterization of a complex creative environment. He used the word collaborative 4 times. At 3:47 p.m., Marcus from the 11 South Kitchen, the sous chef with the daughter in college and the mortgage, posted a single comment beneath Derek's statement. "I was there the night Jordan developed that spice rub. She made it alone. I wrote down her adjustments because her hands were full. That is not collaboration. That is her work." He had not called Jordan first. He had not coordinated with anyone. He had just read the statement, thought about his daughter, and decided there was a version of himself he was no longer willing to be. Within 40 minutes, Camille, the pastry assistant on the work visa, sent Reeves a forwarded copy of the email chain she had been accidentally copied on 6 months earlier. The one where Derek had sent Jordan's cornbread souffle recipe to the Food and Wine editor under his own name. Camille had kept it in a folder she had never opened and never deleted. It was the same email chain Jordan had already provided, but its existence in a second, independent inbox. Received by someone with no stake in the outcome, preserved without coordination, eliminated any remaining argument that the documentation had been fabricated or selectively assembled. 2 independent sources. Same evidence, neither of them aware the other had it. That was when Derek's publicist stopped responding to press inquiries. By Wednesday morning, Derek's cookbook publisher had released a 1-sentence statement confirming they were reviewing the project in light of new information. By Wednesday afternoon, the restaurant group's parent company had issued a statement of their own, notably absent of Derek's name, announcing a full internal review of kitchen operations and attribution practices at 11 South. The NDA offer was formally withdrawn by Claire Okoffer's counterpart at 4:15 p.m. Wednesday, not with an explanation, just a single line. "Our client wishes to rescind the previously proposed separation agreement in its entirety." Jordan was sitting at her kitchen table when Claire forwarded her the email. She read it twice. What had dismantled Derek Holt was not a powerful person intervening on Jordan's behalf. No one had called in a favor. No one had applied pressure from above. What had happened was structurally simpler and, in its way, more complete. A body of evidence so chronologically precise and independently corroborated that the counter-narrative couldn't find a foothold. Derek's own words had done the most damage. The 2019 interview, the Food and Wine correspondence, the Instagram statement using the word collaborative 4 times about a process that 2 witnesses had now described, on record and under their own names, as having been entirely Jordan's. He had built a narrative over 4 years, and narratives, once the architecture is exposed, collapse faster than anything built from facts. The James Beard Foundation quietly removed Derek's pending nomination from their review process. No announcement, no explanation, just an absence where his name had been. 3 days after publication, Marcus Webb called Jordan directly. She almost didn't recognize the number. "I looked right past you," he said when she picked up. No assistant, no lawyer on the line, just his voice, which sounded like a man who had spent several days thinking carefully about something. "That was my failure. I'd like to know how to fix it." Jordan had thought about this moment, not obsessively, but practically the way she thought about most things. "Fund a kitchen incubator," she said, "for self-taught cooks. People who learned the way I learned, at someone's grandmother's stove, not in a building with a ranking." He agreed before she finished the sentence. She noted that. Not with satisfaction, exactly. With the specific clarity of someone who has spent a long time understanding the difference between what people say and what they do, and is paying close attention to which side of that line a person lands on. Before you ever get dismissed, overlooked, or talked over in a room, ask yourself, what would it look like if you'd been quietly building the case the whole time? 3 months later, 11 South reopened under new ownership. The sign above the door read, Jordan Clay's 11 South. Not a collaboration, not a rebranding, a correction. The restaurant group's parent company had settled quietly, the terms undisclosed. The process handled entirely through Claire Okafor's office, without a single court appearance. Jordan had not asked for the restaurant. She had asked for what was owed. The restaurant had been the ownership group's idea, put forward by people who understood, with sudden and practical clarity, that their most valuable asset had never been the name above the door. It had always been the food. The kitchen incubator Webb funded opened the same week as the restaurant. It was called the Estelle Program. Jordan had named it without explanation in the proposal, and Webb had not asked for one. It offered 6-month residencies to self-taught cooks, paid, with full access to professional equipment, mentorship, and, written explicitly into the program charter, full ownership of every recipe developed during the residency. That last clause had been Jordan's condition, non-negotiable. On the first night of service, Marcus Webb sat at table 7. He ordered the smoked short rib. When it arrived, he was quiet for a long moment after the first bite. The particular quiet of someone experiencing something they recognize as significant and choosing not to diminish it with immediate language. He flagged down a server. "Tell the chef," he said, "that I finally see her." The server smiled and went back toward the kitchen. Jordan was at her station. She heard the message relayed. She nodded once, the way she nodded at everything, without excess, without performance, and went back to the plate she was building. Marcus from the old kitchen was her sous chef now. Camille had come back as head of pastry. 2 of the 3 servers from the Webb dinner night were still on the floor. Nobody talked much about what had happened. They didn't need to. It was present in the way the kitchen ran. The attribution practices written into every staff agreement. The recipe notebooks that every cook kept under their own name. The weekly meeting where Jordan reviewed development credit before anything went on the menu. She hadn't built a monument to what had been done to her. She had built a system that made it harder to do to someone else. That was the thing people who hadn't been through it didn't always understand. Justice, when it finally comes, doesn't feel like winning. It feels like being able to do your work in a room where the walls are finally honest. If this story made you think about someone you know who's been building quietly in the background, share it. They probably won't tell you themselves.